everybody, and welcome. I'm very happy to be here and to be speaking to such a broad and diverse group of people. And it's very encouraging to see the amount of interest and diversity of stakeholders in the room. And it gives me, I guess, some hopes and confidence that there is a coordinated and a vested interest in using here in Slovenia in the prevention of this problem. I'm also very sorry to say that I haven't been. I'm also very sorry to say that I didn't prepare anything to say in Slovakian, Slovenian, so I'm afraid I can't kind of follow on from Kasia. That was really very impressive, Kasia. But I would like to extend my thanks to today's hosts, and particularly to Tony and to Andre for the invitation to speak here today. Okay. I'm here to introduce to you an initiative that was established about 3 years ago with a rather snappy title of the International Working Group on Best Practice in the Management and Prevention of Online Sex Offending Behaviour. This is not just my work, and I certainly don't want to take sole credit for it. So I will introduce my two colleagues of the International Work Group, Professor Derek Perkins and Dr. Hannah Murden, who are both based in the UK. And together we've been coordinating this work over the last 3 years. The International Working Group on Best Practice in the Management and Prevention of Online Offending Behaviour was established under the aegis of the 13th Biennial Conference of the International Association for Treatment of Sexual Offenders Conference. That was held in Porto in 2014, actually in September, so it's technically our 3-year anniversary. And Hannah and Derek and I really established it at that conference because we realised that there was an increasing and sometimes seemingly uncontrollable problem in relation to the scale and the impact of online child sexual offending behaviours. And we considered, based on our professional experience, we've collectively worked in this area for over 40 years, that really, while there are lots of valuable interventions, so certainly at the level of law enforcement who've been charged with the management of this behavioural problem, certainly in the last 20 years, there are many valuable educational interventions, preventative interventions, such as the Network Prevention Project, for example, here in Slovenia. There are many important initiatives, such as the operation of the INCOV network and the national hotlines, which deal with the issue of child sexual exploitation material content, for example. We felt that there was a lack of something, and that something being a lack of a coordinated effort to try to combat the actual behaviours that underpin the problem of online child sexual abuse and exploitation. And as the years have gone on, that problem has become increasingly complex. Now, I'll come to that in a moment, but certainly with the advent of smartphone technology, with the fact that children have, largely free access to the internet and to all the wonderful things that brings, but also to the risks that it sometimes presents to children, particularly to the more vulnerable children. And so we felt that as a community of psychologists and clinical psychologists, forensic psychologists, and certainly within the group of the International Association for Treatment of Sexual Offenders, we felt that there was a vast knowledge in terms of academic knowledge, clinical knowledge, and practical expertise in the management and prevention of sexual offending within that community. And so in a sense, I suppose, establishing the International Work Group under the auspices of the IACTO conference was quite a deliberate decision, because what we wanted to do was to raise the profile of the issue of online sexual offending within this international community of treatment practitioners, therapists, academics who work with sex offenders, and also to try to leverage that skill and expertise that resides within that group, and then through processes of outreach and consultation with our stakeholders and partners in education, in law enforcement, in the judiciary, in probation, in prisons, in all of the sectors that have a vested interest in the management and prevention of online child sexual offending behaviour, to try to move towards a position where we identify what the challenges are for more effective management and prevention of online child sexual offender behaviour, where good practice exists, and also to see whether or not that good practice could be transferred, for example, to other jurisdictions, and essentially to move towards the development of evidence-led policy and practice for better management and prevention of this problem. So that is the fundamental objective, the fundamental premise of the international work group. And so today what I'm going to do is just talk you through some of our consultations that have been rolling over the last 3 years and describe to you some of the key challenges and key requirements that exist and have been articulated to us by our colleagues in education, the police, judiciary, all relevant sectors, and describe to you then some of the future work that we are planning under the auspices of the IWG. So, obviously I've described who I am, and here's my email, but just to introduce to you also my colleagues. And so Professor Derek Perkins is a consultant clinical and forensic psychologist, and he's worked for many years in the high security hospital, Broadmoor Hospital in the UK. He's affiliated to the West London Mental Health Trust, and he's also an honorary professor of forensic psychology at Royal Holloway University of London. My other colleague, Hannah Meridian, Dr. Hannah Meridian, she's a senior lecturer in clinical and forensic psychology in the University of Lincoln, and Hannah and Derek together manage a research partnership called Online Protect. And they're very interested in understanding the pathways that offenders and individuals, follow to becoming online child sexual offenders. They're also interested in questions around desistance. So what happens when some people just stop offending? And we know that people do desist from offending, but we also know very little about it. So they're very concerned with those kinds of questions. And similarly, those are questions that we also ask under the auspices of the IWG's work. I'd like to play for you a short clip. This is taken from a BBC News, I suppose it was kind of a short section that was done in the media about 2 weeks ago by BBC Victoria Derbyshire. And the reason I played it for you is because Derek, my colleague, was featured in this particular clip. But not just because Derek was featured in something in the media. The reason I play this for you is that it illustrates, and certainly the public response to this media piece, illustrates some of the challenges that persist, both in terms of broader understanding of the problem of online child sexual exploitation, and also the challenges that we present if we are trying to implement and design meaningful prevention programs for this problem. I always start and end with the same premise. Regardless of how distasteful most people consider these behaviours and sexual interests to be, if we are all serious about safeguarding prevention, then outright protection of children, primary prevention must be a collective goal. So I need to play this video. There are some subtitles in English at the bottom of the slide as well.
I think I'm normal, yeah. I went to uni, have a job, do normal things. I was probably about 13 when I first became aware. I think it was when all of my friends started talking about girls and I was thinking about boys. It would kill me really to ever think that I could ruin someone's life. I just don't want to do that.
Are you comfortable telling us the age of the children you are attracted to?
Yeah, so my age of attraction is 1 to 15, but as they get younger, the emotional attraction is more prominent. I don't really think of a toddler in much of a sexual way, but rather just I want to cuddle one and make sure they're happy, and that is mainly it with younger children.
There are going to be people watching this that will find that so difficult to hear.
I don't think it's really that crazy. I mean, to want to make children happy, make sure they're safe. I thought paedophiles were old men who looked at children I didn't really think I was one. But then I tried to hide it, just tried to ignore it, pretend it wasn't there, pretend I was normal, concentrate on my schoolwork, concentrate on playing football.
We need to do much more to make sure that services are more accessible to people who are struggling with their sexual thoughts and feelings, who haven't committed a sexual offence, and who want the support and guidance so that they don't act upon those feelings. And in many ways, it's easier to prevent child sexual abuse in some contexts than to have to pick up the pieces and the costs of that after the event.
I appreciate that's a very uncomfortable thing to watch. The reality is that for therapists, for clinicians, for people, professionals like those who work in the likes of the Abuse and Faithful Foundation helpline in the UK, and those who work in similar preventative organisations internationally, this is a very common problem. There are many, many individuals who are in the community and who we know move outside of the range of law enforcement who maintain a sexual interest in children. And I think as a society you have two choices. You can ignore the fact that these individuals are there and that they struggle with their thoughts and feelings. You can let them sit with their thoughts and feelings and try to self-manage. And of course with that comes the risk that they will act on their urges and impulses and commit sexual offences against children. Or indeed, you can develop, as they have done in the UK and in other jurisdictions, supports, confidential supports that deal with individuals in the community, such as those who have not yet acted on their impulses, in order to help them to self-manage and not to offend. The public reaction to this is really quite interesting. And I'm showing you examples from Twitter, and as you might have imagined, the level of debate on Twitter was rather informed and very academic. So Derek was interviewed as part of this process, and he just simply stated something very clear, well-established facts within the clinical psychological community, and certainly in terms of kind of management and prevention. So simply that paedophilia is recognised as a mental health disorder. It's not something that somebody chooses to have. There are exceptions to that, of course. There are individuals who elect in a very deliberate way to commit sexual offences against children. And it's a diverse and a varied population that we're dealing with here. You can see already that there was quite a large reaction to Derek's piece that was also run on the Victoria Derbyshire Twitter feed. So the reactions range from this kind of content, so some suggested cures for paedophilia here were hopefully proposed by some followers of this Twitter thread. So, application solutions such as execution, etc., etc. There are also those, of course, who welcomed the opportunity for an informed public debate on this. So some individuals here say this is really good, we need to have open debates about this problem, not as a way of condoning behaviour, please, but as a way of simply acknowledging that this problem exists and that as a society that we need to do something to prevent it from festering into something that becomes very, very much a problem for children. And interestingly here, there's a woman on the top here who self-identifies as being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and she says, look, we need to listen to the stories these men and women are telling us. We need to understand more about their predilections and their interests, however uncomfortable it is for us. We need to hear, we need to learn, and we need to educate. Derek himself came in for a bit of accusation, so I don't know what the translation's like here, but nonce is an English slang term for paedophile, so it says here that this guy suggested that Derek actually looks like a paedophile, which I thought was interesting. But this comment here, I thought, finally struck at the kernel the issue, and I had to draw through, many hundred of the 943 comments that followed from Derek's piece. And this individual here said, look, the problem with UK child protection policies, and actually the problem with child protection policies internationally, is that they're not evidence-based. We're not really considering what we're doing in terms of practical intervention in the face of the evidence. That's not always the case. There are many, many initiatives that are developed and driven by the evidence. I'm aware of those, and they work very, very well. But we still have poor evaluation in terms of the quality of management interventions, in terms of the quality of preventative interventions. And so this really, I suppose, speaks to the rationale for the establishment of the International Working Group. This is a very confused policy space. So 20 years ago, we had the advent of the mainstreaming, I suppose, of the problem of child exploitation material, child sexual abuse material, and a lot of confusion at the level of those who are involved in the management of sex offenders and prevention of sexual offences about what does this mean, and are these people different from those who commit contact sexual offences against children? Within those groups, within those who engage with child exploitation material, and within those who contact sexual offend, and within those who are paedophilic, you have a lot of diversity. So, for example, you have individuals who may have an impulse to look at child exploitation material but not to touch children, but who resist those urges. Similarly, you may have individuals who have urges to commit sexual offences against children, contact sexual offences, but who resist those urges. You have those who are highly deviant, who engage in contact sexual exploitation material or contact sexual offences, and those who look at the material or who do both. It's a very, very diverse group. And in the last 15 years, of course, we've seen the advent of social media, smartphone technology, children's access to the internet, which has, certainly been very rapid and unprecedented. And unfortunately, of course, we see increasingly children's involvement in the production of sexual materials, some of which has a criminal element to it, and others which are produced and exchanged in the context of consensual peer-to-peer relationships. And the result of all of these developments is that this makes for occasionally a very confused public debate, and also a very confused policy-making and legislative space. Andy often talks about this notion of legislative hyperactivity, and certainly in the UK, we've seen so much legislation come into place to combat this problem over the last 10 to 15 years, so many laws, but we still don't really understand how effective they are. So many policies, but we don't know on what evidence base they're being formed. And so really, what we were trying to do within the IWG was to try to bring a little bit of clarity to what is a very, very confused legislative, policy-making and practical space. So just in the course of today's presentation, what I'll talk to you about is the rationale for the establishment of the International Work Group, the aims of the group and its 2-year consultation process, which is running up to 3 years now. Also, we look at the major conclusions of an international consultation, Delphi consultation that was conducted in 2016. So Delphi, just for clarification, is basically a methodology, a technique that's used as a formal way of developing a position of international expert consensus in relation to a topic or issue where there is no research evidence, basically. And also going to talk about the next steps for the IWG. So, in terms of the rationale, we like for the International Work Group, I've touched on this basically, but we've obviously noted major issues in terms of the scale and the impact of online child sexual offending over the last 20 years. So certainly we've seen increased media reports on issues around increasing numbers of possession, distribution, production offences, increased activity in regards to the phenomenon of live streaming of sexual abuse. So, for example, it's possible for an individual living in the UK or Ireland to remotely abuse or exploit a child from the Philippines or perhaps from Thailand by webcam. We've also seen an increase in terms of the responses to the problem. So certainly, when this problem first emerged, it was clearly identified as a criminal justice issue. And the mantle of responsibility for intervention falls squarely on the shoulders of law enforcement, as it should as a first line of response. So certainly law enforcement responses have been abounding, they've been incredible in terms of their progress. Also, we've seen a lot of responses that have obviously emphasised this problem as one of content. So looking at the material, ensuring that the public can't access it, trying to combat problems around re-victimisation of children by kind of redistribution and resharing of their images. Also working with law enforcement to support takedowns of relevant content providers, etc., etc., etc. And then also in terms of prevention, importantly and critically within schools, we've seen massive, investment, certainly at that level of the European Commission in terms of educational interventions for children in schools. What's missing here, of course, is an emphasis on the assessment, management, prevention of the actual behaviour that underlies child sexual exploitation. And comparatively few international initiatives kind of emphasise issues around the prevention of these actual behaviours. This has very real consequences. I mean, everybody in the room is aware that there have been, increased reports of, very, very large numbers of individuals involved in viewing, accessing, downloading, viewing, engaging with child sexual exploitation materials, including children themselves. And this, of course, this problem has massive structural consequences for those involved in managing this problem and responding to it, in terms of the caseloads, the numbers of cases they're trying to process, the level of law enforcement, in terms of schools, in terms of other relevant interventions. And also it creates a really massive burden of responsibility on law enforcement, on teachers, people working in healthcare contexts who come across these kinds of cases, to make risk-related decisions with often very little information available to them at their disposal about how best to make decisions that are victim-centric and most effectively respond to and manage the problem. And this, of course, has massive public protection implications, particularly for law enforcement who are invested in this sector. We have, and I'm delighted to say that certainly in the 16 years that I'm working in the area, we've seen a massive increase in terms of the knowledge base, the amount of work that's been done in this area, focusing on issues to do with children's use of the internet, risks on safety responses, but also importantly in relation to understanding and developing our understanding of online child sexual offenders, their risks and treatment needs, etc., etc. The difficulty with a lot of this research is that it's fragmented, it's siloed. There's very little knowledge exchange between the two sectors, so between people who work on children's use of the internet and those who work to develop our understanding of online child sexual exploitation offences. People frequently work in silos, and I know it's difficult because we all have so much work to do in our respective areas. We often have networks and events like this where we come together for a day or a number of days. But there's very good platform for persistent exchange of knowledge and ideas and information, discussion around challenges and requirements. There's no permanent platform that's been established to support that. And in fact, actually, very often this information is not available to people who are in the position of making risk-related decisions, whether it's in relation to offenders or in relation to victims. Also, importantly, individual countries vary in terms of how they respond to this problem, how they manage the problem, how education programs are administered, for example, the level of resources and the quality of the law enforcement response, for example, it varies widely from country to country. And as I mentioned already, our knowledge exchange activities tend to be at the level of law enforcement, or at the level of academia, or the level of commissions, and with very, very little opportunity for cross-stakeholder exchange and knowledge development. So therefore, the aims of the international work group were to try to provide some sort of a platform, some sort of response to this problem. And our overarching aim really is to develop more effective, evidence-based practice for better management and prevention of online child sexual offending behaviour. This requires a couple of things. So importantly for us, we feel that there's a lot of academic interest in this area, there's a lot of individual projects. Sometimes they pull in different directions, they don't really seem to follow a common goal in terms of improving the quality of our management or prevention responses. So from our perspective, and certainly from an academic perspective, it was important for us to try to begin to steer international research along the lines of something like an agenda to try to meet the requirements and the needs of those who work with victims, offenders, in prevention spaces with children, to try to understand, where are the knowledge gaps for you, what are the challenges to effective intervention, and how can we make all of the academic knowledge that's not locked up in academic journals too often more accessible to your frontline practice? How can we bring it to bear in terms of your practical policy? And in order to do this, of course, we have to create a platform that facilitates this knowledge exchange. And that means that it's not just, it shouldn't just be a situation where you have academics sitting in a dusty room of bookshelves who's making decisions about where the research agenda needs to go. The research objectives in this area, the knowledge development objectives in terms of where we need to go in developing risk assessment tools, for example, whether they're for use in school settings and dealing with sexting case, or whether it's for use in frontline law enforcement settings in dealing with a similar case. We need to engage with practitioners, and we know that practitioners need to tell us what your knowledge development needs are, where you need us to focus our efforts as academics and as clinicians. So in order to do this, we began to undertake a series of consultations, cross-stakeholder consultations with law enforcement, individuals in policing, judiciary, education sector, health sector, as I outlined on the previous slide. We run a series of consultations at this stage. So the first, of course, was conducted under the auspices of our inaugural launch, if you like, that was at the IACSA conference in Porto. We held one in London with the support of the National Crime Agency's Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command in 2015. Also, we've engaged with international groupings of clinicians, therapists, treatment providers who are working with online child sexual offending. And then, of course, importantly, from May to July of last year, we ran an international Delphi survey with a very large group of respondents from a broad range of sectors, which I'll describe in a moment. And then finally, we brought those findings back to the therapeutic groups, to clinical groups, to police officers, and others engaged with the management of prevention of sexual offending at the IACSA conference in Copenhagen. Really what we wanted to do was quite simple. We wanted to understand from each of the stakeholder groups what the key challenges were in terms of trying to effectively assess, manage, and prevent online child sexual exploitation offending behaviour. We also, though, wanted to try to reflect and acknowledge that good practice exists in this space already, and we wanted to provide some kind of avenue for the acknowledgement of that good practice, and also an avenue for dissemination of that information and good practice to other jurisdictions where it may be applied. We also wanted to look at it from the perspective of trying to understand that individuals are not just, they don't just sort of exist within a single realm of intervention. An offender exists within the community for a very long period of time, as we saw in the earlier film. I mean, this young man here self-identified his interests from in and around the age of 13. So from the age of 13, this individual has been struggling and trying to manage these sexual thoughts towards children. These individuals exist in the community for a very, very long time often before they come to the attention of law enforcement. If they do come to the attention of law enforcement, and many don't, they may or may not act upon their interests. When they come to the attention of law enforcement, they're investigated, very often they're bailed and left in the community for long periods of time. They are then prosecuted. Sometimes they serve jail time, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they receive intervention, therapeutically, sometimes they don't. Then they may be on probation for a period of time, and then they're released back into the community. So if you're considering management and prevention, you need to think about the journey of a particular offender, the potential journeys and potential pathways that the individuals can follow. And so really what we wanted to do is try to look at all of these different points in the offending cycle and try to understand where good practice exists around management and prevention. And particularly, as I said, we're concerned to understand more about resistance and prevention. Because, as I say, we know that certain individuals don't ever act upon their desires. Other individuals do, and then they desist or they stop offending. And we know very, very little formally in terms of the published empirical work about under what conditions individuals desist from offending. And that's very, very important because it can inform better prevention strategy. So moving on to the Delphi survey. The Delphi survey, as I say, was conducted between May and July 2016. We consulted a very large number, a broad range of stakeholder groups, with a fairly even distribution. So 21% of our respondents were from law enforcement, 19% were academics, researchers, people like me working in universities, 17% worked in therapeutic and other forms of intervention, both with sex offenders and with their victims. 17% worked in mental health services, 14% policymakers, government bodies, National Offender Management Services in the UK, Ministries of Justice, Ministries of the Interior, etc., and 12% worked in charities and NGOs. So we had a broad range of respondents from quite a number of countries. We obviously can't list them all here, but here's just a sample of the countries from which our respondents derived. And basically we accessed a multi-professional group of about 2,000 experts, and we used and leveraged the networks of other stakeholders and colleagues and collaborators with the IWG in order to achieve this. So, special thanks to Europol, because they allowed us to distribute our surveys via their platform, their police platforms, for example, and also through our own networks, Derek's network, my network, Hannah's network, the National Crime Agency, the Online Tech Research Group and its affiliates. And there were 3 rounds to the study consultation. So an initial survey, where a large group of stakeholders provided responses to 18 questions. Then we shaped a more detailed survey based on the kinds of feedback we got from the first round, which provided 20 questions. And then finally, we invited a sub-sample of individuals to engage in online interviews with us to talk in more detail about their specific challenges, requirements, and examples of good practice within their various areas of intervention, so whether they're working with police, the judiciary, hotline providers, treatment providers, etc., etc. There was a couple of major outcomes from this consultation. So there was a consensus across the expert group that there needs to be better international cooperation, so at the level of hotlines, at the level of law enforcement, at the level of the online industry, to begin to better target high-level producers and distributors of child sexual exploitation materials, so effectively those from, who are involved in the origination of the material, if you like. Also, crucially, there was a very clear consensus that there is a very important role for preventative education intervention from childhood onwards around what child sexual exploitation material is, under what circumstances it is illegal to produce and disseminate this kind of material. Also, I suppose, more nuanced issues with very important issues to children and young people in terms of understanding where the boundaries should lie in terms of online sexual behaviour for most children and young people. And the other, I suppose, aspect of the consensus was that they felt that this kind of knowledge and information needs to be, I suppose, instilled from a very early age. So not in terms of delivering age-inappropriate messaging to children who are, for example, prepubescent, but just helping them to understand that, what an image is, that it's a commodity, that it belongs to you, and that there are certain images that will be private, others that will be made public, for example. Because the difficulty is that if you begin with these interventions in, for example, from secondary school age, so 13 onwards, very often the behaviours are already established and it's too late. You need other forms of intervention like CBT. The respondents also spoke about the potential benefits of something like a public health type approach to this problem. Fundamentally, paedophilia is it's a psychological disorder, and therefore it would make sense to suggest that there would be some sort of a public health response to this issue. The challenge comes, of course, in terms of the political appetite to engage in these kinds of preventative approaches at the community level. Politically, there isn't really much interest in these kinds of interventions because it's not politically appetizing to suggest that we should do anything with individuals who have the capacity to sexually offend against children other than lock them up in prison. And that creates challenges in terms of how we can meaningfully design public awareness prevention campaigns. But there are some really good examples, and I'll come to those in a moment. So in terms of the more detailed findings, I'll just kind of maybe just sample for you some of the key findings in terms of core challenges, key requirements that were articulated by various sectors, and also some examples of good practice from a number of key sectors. And certainly in terms of policing, investigation, prosecution, so I suppose the criminal justice side of things, there were a whole range of challenges and requirements articulated to us by the law enforcement agencies and representatives who we surveyed. The first has to do with the organisation of investigative workflow. The problem, of course, now, as I mentioned already, is that online sexual offending, particularly as expressed through engagement with child exploitation material, has become a high-volume crime. And it also requires very intensive investigation. There's a lot of concern that in the process of doing a forensic review of a hard drive, for example, that you might miss a victim. There might be that one new image that you haven't seen before. And therefore, if you miss that image, you might miss a potential victim of this particular individual. And sometimes, in terms of trying to achieve a balance between efficiency in processing the numbers of cases, and also in trying to kind of meet the requirements to be thorough in your investigation, some difficult decisions have to be made. So, for example, Police Scotland, they were experiencing particular problems around suicide rate in terms of the individuals that they were apprehending for child exploitation material related offences. And this was really to do with the fact that very often you had suspects who were bailed, who were on bail and left in the community before their court appearances, sometimes in very long periods of time while the forensic review of their hard drive was done. That created problems in relation to suicide, so offenders taking their lives, and also, of course, in relation to individuals who are actually at very high risk to children who were released back into the community for long periods of time and therefore may continue to offend. So what we decided to do was to rapidly increase their forensic processing rate in order to make sure that they would get back to the courts very, very quickly with relevant evidence to secure the prosecution, to make sure that the individual was engaged in a very early stage of management services. And so they injected a 20% forensic staff increase, they changed their forensic review procedures, and this resulted in a very significant increase in case processing rates, early engagement of the offender with management intervention, and importantly, when I last spoke to them, they'd had zero suicides in the 2 years since they implemented this change. There are also some very, very difficult decisions for law enforcement to make in relation to which individuals, in the context of those who are accessing child exploitation material, may pose a particular risk to children, whether it's in terms of maybe perhaps being also those who are committing concurrent contact sexual offences against children, or indeed those who are at risk of reoffending. So, for example, there are a range of good practice examples that we identified to support police in making those decisions, where you can bring the advice of external experts, individuals who have particular expertise with respect to management of online offenders, to bear in making those decisions. So, for example, some units have incorporated a behavioural investigative advisor to assist law enforcement officers with making those decisions about, for example, who to target first in the context of an online investigation where you may have many, many targets engaging with child exploitation material. Who may present the most likelihood of presenting an ongoing risk of contact offending against children, for example. Those are difficult decisions for an independent law enforcement officer to make, and particularly in the online space, you've got very, very limited behavioural information available to you. Also, there are similar investigative decision supports technologies such as the Kent Internet Risk Assessment Tool, or KIRMAT, one that was developed by myself and my colleague Siobhan Hammond, which basically seeks to identify individuals who may be at risk of repeat engagement with child exploitation material, or who are at particular risk of contact offending against individuals of peer-to-peer networks software. And there was a lot of talk about how and under what circumstances police should engage with preventative strategies. So they do, of course, in many contexts, they're heavily engaged in many countries, and in schools programs, educational programs, and as I mentioned already, Tony has the National Prevention Programme here, which is a kind of a really inspired piece of work, so sort of a peer-led and kind of a youth mentoring type scheme. Also, there are examples from Europol, for example, the police-to-peer operation, which I don't have time to describe now. But there is a lot of, and actually, so strong is this feeling, some law enforcement officers we're saying actually our performance indicators need to be changed to make sure that we are tasked by our superiors with being involved in prevention of this programme or this problem. But there is limited information available still about how and in what circumstances law enforcement could be engaged in those problems, or in the problem. In terms of treatment interventions, we know that some child exploitation material offenders don't respond well to treatment intervention. It's not always necessary or relevant or appropriate to law or to a child exploitation material offender to place them in a therapeutic programme that's designed for more general sex offenders. Sometimes it can be counterproductive. They can network with other offenders. They may want to conduct offence against children, for example, or indeed the content of programmes is not relevant to them and it's a waste of time and a waste of resources. There's also, of course, the ongoing problem about how to be better identifying those with the propensity to escalate to more serious forms of offending, so contact offending and crossover offences. And also, of course, we've had a very strong response in favour of more, I suppose, kind of public-facing deterrence and prevention programmes. So as it comes through, for example, public awareness videos and the campaigns of the likes of Lucy Faithfull Foundation in the UK. We are aware of the activities of the Dunkelfeld Project in Germany, who offer, outside of the criminal justice system, therapeutic support and intervention to individuals who self-identify as having a sexual interest in children in the community. A couple of things to say. We also spoke to some other advisors to the International Work Group. So, for example, to John Brown, who is the Director of Development Strategy, and something else for the National Society for Preventing Abuse of Children in the UK, because we wanted to understand their perception of the problem and where they see the challenges and requirements as design. Importantly, critically, we need further work to improve our victim identification responses, also to inform the development of therapeutic programmes for those who are trying to work with children who've been abused and exploited online. Their needs are distinct, they are various, they are often very complex, and we don't have very much information available to us in terms of formal academic literature to inform these interventions. That's really important. Critically, we need to talk to children. We need to bring the voice of the child to bear in what we are doing in our daily work, and that goes for all of us. We've really seen in the last 10 years, with children becoming more closely engaged with the problem of online child sexual exploitation through self-generation of images, etc., that we need to understand more about their motivations to engage in these kinds of behaviours, to understand and to challenge problematic attitudes where they do reside with children. Very often they don't have the opportunity to talk about these problems in schools. And this voice has been absent both in the academic literature and also in our practical responses to the problem. So, I know very few people, and he's probably one of the few people who I know who actually goes into schools, speaks to children, talks to them about these kinds of issues and publishes about it. We've seen police examples reported in the UK in the last week of police officers where you've had a case of a child who was coerced into self-generating and sent an image, a sexual image of herself to a paedophile. Her mother reported it to the police, and the police officer advised her that she was at risk of being charged, that she had committed criminal offence. That's not good enough. That child was a victim. So I'm not saying that it's an isolated case, but what it reflects is a misunderstanding of the problem, and of the fact that where children are coerced and where they're victimised, they should not be blamed when they're instigating these kinds of offences. I was thinking about that case actually, and I thought it was quite disturbing, because I thought it kind of harks back to the old victim blaming stuff that you used to see with victims of rape years and years ago. And I thought actually for any sex offender who was reading the news and saw that that the likes of a law enforcement officer would be threatening to charge a child who was clearly victimised in the context of a bullying exchange, I thought, my goodness, that actually feeds very well into the sex offender's narrative, that the victim was to blame. Anyway, it's just a reflection. We have a number of additional research requirements, which I really don't have time to kind of go into now. But one to note is that we have very, very little in terms of well-validated risk assessment tools for assessing the particular criminal risks and treatment needs of those who are involved in child exploitation material offending. We have one called the C-Port that works for people who have a prior history of sexual offending, but we know that in most cases of individuals who are picked up on having child exploitation material offences, that very often they don't have a history of offending. And so we don't have a way of meaningfully risk assessing those individuals, nor do we have a way of risk assessing youth populations who are involved in child sexual exploitation material offending. And that's a significant gap in terms of how well we can effectively manage and prevent this problem. So in terms of the next steps for the IWG, we are developing a consensus paper, which is basically a collection of all of the responses that we've received over the last 2 to 3 years through our IWG consultations. We're currently compiling that into a paper, an academic paper that will be peer-reviewed and published. And once we've gone through that kind of quality assurance, peer review and publication process, we'll then produce a public-facing version of that report with targeted advice for relevant sectors to the management and prevention of online child sexual exploitation. We are also independently involved in a range of clinical and operational research partnerships with law enforcement, such as, for example, the collaboration with Europol on the Sexual Exploitation and Coercion Report, and also other kind of joint work to try to improve police responses to child victims of child sexual exploitation as well. And also, at the moment, we are working to develop a more formal network to support the implementation and the mainstreaming of the practical advice and recommendations that will be contained in the consensus paper. We strongly feel that this needs to be a permanent platform. Just to thank, this is just some of the collaborators for the international work group, and just to thank and to acknowledge those collaborators, and particularly Europol, who are represented in the room with us. And finally, Tony asked me to say something about where we came from and where we're going with this kind of offending. It's a really, really difficult thing to try to do. I mean, 15, 16 years ago when I first started working in the area, I was looking at internet news groups, which were kind of a contained, highly specialised, very technical forum used by a certain, quasi-educated group of online child sexual offenders for the exchange of images. Very slow exchange, very slow broadband speeds, certain amounts of encryption. Encryption's always been there. It was there 15, 16 years ago, and it's still there. I could never have imagined what would happen with the advent of a smartphone, or how children would become so heavily embroiled and intertwined with the problem of online child sexual exploitation. But one thing that struck me going forward, and just a point of reflection to finish on, I was at a conference with Andy, actually, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, about 2 weeks ago, where there was a group of clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, who had a special session on social media and the issues that present, the particular issues that are challenging therapy and intervention and making children vulnerable on social media. There was a lot of presentations of individuals talking about how children are using and engaging with self-harm communities online, getting advice and information about how to harm themselves without being detected, how to commit suicide, for example. Other forums where there were young people, pro-ana sites, for example, exchanging advice and information about how to restrict your calorie intake, amongst other things. Very, very harmful, fundamentally harmful forums for children. And similarly, within those forums, there was some evidence of adults with a sexual interest in children targeting girls within pro-ana sites. These special interest sex offenders who like very, very thin girls, or girls who are purging, for example. And so it seems that there's an absence of guardianship in these spaces, which I think is a fundamental challenge to the prevention of sexual exploitation. And I think it's the most difficult challenge. How do we institute guardianship in those spaces? How does the clinical psychologist or therapist understand what's really going on for a child in those kinds of spaces? How do they access it? How do they know? The same thing goes for parents. The same thing goes for law enforcement. The same thing goes for educators who are trying to deal, for example, with a sexting case. How do we institute proper guardianship in these spaces? It's a real particular challenge. And just on another final point, just to say that what struck me about this was that the boundaries between these spaces, between online child sexual offenders and children who are operating in independent groups elsewhere online, they seem to be becoming increasingly blurred. with increasingly poor outcomes for children. So, for example, just a reflection on the sexual exploitation and coercion report, I was speaking to a colleague of mine who's involved in a piece of work who's trying to understand the role of the internet in the recruitment of children for use in drug trafficking. And he spoke to me about a number of cases that his colleague has identified through consultation with the various a number of drug units in the UK. And the interesting thing about these cases is that he spoke about all of the characteristics of sexual coercion and extortion. When a girl meets a guy online, she takes a picture of herself, she sends it to him, she's partly, she's effectively groomed, or she's coerced, or she's deceived. And then what this individual was doing was that he was using the images as a threat, and basically saying to her that if you don't traffic these drugs for me, if you don't work as my mule, I'm going to send this to everybody. And I thought that was a really concerning development. That we're not just talking about sexual exploitation in and of itself, we're talking about overlaps with other forms of criminality as well. And this speaks to the importance of guardianship in these online spaces. And also, it underscores the fundamental importance of the work that everybody in this room is trying to do to prevent and to inform the public about this problem. Okay, I'd like to leave it there, but just to say thank you very much to everybody, and particular thanks to my hosts and sponsors for inviting speakers today.